Trump has said of his Secretary of State, "We are always on the same wavelength." As you'll see in my interview with Mike Pompeo, that's apparent. We began our conversation today discussing Iran and his predecessor John Kerry's wildly destructive communications with the world's largest state sponsor of terror. Here's part one of my interview with Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. Mr. Secretary, thanks so much for joining us tonight. We really appreciate it.
Great to be with you.
Iran in the news. Brian Hook, your special envoy, saying, we want to deal with Iran, but a treaty with Iran. Iranian leaders, no go. They're like, we don't want any dealings with the United States at this point. What's going on?
President Trump's been very clear since the time he was running for office that the arrangement that the previous administration put in place was bad for America, frankly, bad for the world. And so I and Brian are working to get Iran to behave like a normal nation, right? Stop being the world's largest state sponsor of terror. Stop launching missiles through proxies. Stop attacking our embassies and consulates. When we get those basic things in place, President Trump's made very clear. We'd love Iran to rejoin the community of nations, but their revolutionary zeal causes them to be a bad actor, and they need to shape up. And if they do, we'll get it right.
Well, again, you and John Kerry have gone back and forth on this. Former Secretary of State Barack Obama has met 4 times with Iranian leadership. And you guys criticized, saying that's not appropriate, given, you can't have a 2-track foreign policy here. But he responded by saying there's nothing unusual, let alone unseemly or inappropriate, about former diplomats meeting with foreign counterparts. Secretary of State Kissinger done it for decades with Russia and China. What is unseemly and unprecedented for the podium of the State Department to be hijacked for political theatrics?
Secretary Kerry can't seem to get off the stage, and you have to. When I'm the former secretary, I'll get off. Every previous former secretary has done that too. It's one thing to meet with your counterpart. It's another thing to do what Secretary Kerry, Wendy Sherman, Ernest Moniz, frankly, the whole gang has done, which is to actively seek to undermine what President Trump is trying to achieve. It's okay to talk with him, but you have to be working for America, working for American foreign policy, and they're not. They're working for the foreign policy that is theirs, not the one that belongs to the United States.
Our own Dana Perino last week had Kerry on, and he did not deny that he wanted to basically tell the Iranians that whether he told the Iran to wait it out for the next administration.
I think everybody in the world is sitting around talking about waiting out President Trump.
At what point does the administration pursue some type of legal action against former Secretary Kerry and others from the former administration?
I'll leave the legal action to others. I'm trying to execute America's foreign policy, and they are not only unhelpful, but they are acting in ways that are harmful to achieving what's best for the American people. And that's my criticism. Stop it. Let it go. You had your day. We think you fundamentally got it wrong with Iran, and we're trying to make it right for America.
And reducing the refugee number, that's caused great consternation. It's another issue that President Trump campaigned on, extreme vetting, security for our country. Down to 30,000 next fiscal year. Bob Menendez, big fan of the administration, called it cruel and short-sighted. Human Rights First, another group. It's an abdication, Mr. Secretary, of our humanity. Your response?
America is the most generous nation in the history of civilization. It always has been, and it continues to be under President Trump. We want to get it right for the American people. We've taken in over 4 million legal permanent residents in the last almost 2 decades now. We continue to take in more people than most countries in the rest of the world. But we got to get the security piece right. We got to make sure that we allow those who are in most trouble, most harm's way, to be taken care of in the best place to take care of them, nearer their own country. Those are not heartless things. Those are things that are kind and caring and decent. It's the way we ought to treat our fellow human beings, and it's what we in the Trump administration are committing to do.
What does this administration say to the Christian refugees who feel, many of them abandoned for many years, predating this administration, in Syria, in Iraq, and beyond? They can't go to these camps because they're afraid of going to the camps. How do we reach them? How do we get some of them into the country?
So it's an important and difficult challenge. We want to bring in all those who are most in trouble and are having the most difficulty in the places in which they reside. Vice President Pence has made this a real priority to ensure that Christians are being treated fairly and equitably in our processes. We've seen some of these issues in these camps. Rest assured that the State Department's working to make sure that Christians are not being mistreated, prosecuted, persecuted, or treated in any way that's unfair as they try to make their way into the United States of America.
The U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom lists China and Saudi Arabia, right? One, and I think Saudi Arabia is number 3 of the worst violators of human rights. I was thinking about this yesterday because thinking of the old Soviet Union and President Reagan, who both of us admire so much. We didn't do that really heavily engaged trade with the Soviet Union, not just because of nukes, but because of what they were doing on human rights. So how do we justify this huge trading relationship with Saudi Arabia and China, given how we treat then North Korea and a place like Cuba? It seems like there's selective treatment of human rights violations.
So it's always the case when you're trying to advocate for America's interests that you have to weigh the relative concerns, and it is the case that each country presents its own situation. What I think we've been incredibly consistent on is making sure that we identify, we call out these concerns. I've done it with respect to China. I've done it with respect to every place we find religious minorities being mistreated. We held the first ever religious ministerial in the very room in which we're sitting here. It was quite an occasion. People from nearly every religion and 80 delegations. This administration is taking religious freedom all around the world, in China and other places,
1 million
very
Muslims
seriously.
in China being detained, Christian churches, crosses being smashed, churches driven underground, pastors being imprisoned. And, you know, what we have to talk about, my good friend, President Xi, it's heartbreaking to so many of us who care about religious liberty. And I know this is an administration priority, but what do you do? What leverage do we have with China at this point, other than what we're doing now with trade?
Laura, I'm confident we'll talk about China in other contexts too. It presents a myriad of opportunities, but lots of challenges. You speak of one. This is a non-transparent government. It is still a very centralized government. It treats our intellectual property horribly. It treats its religious minorities horribly. In each of these cases, we have opportunities. You've seen what the president's doing with trade to try and make it fair and reciprocal. What we're asking of China is to behave in a way that if they want to be a power, if they want to be on the global stage, they have to operate in the way that global leaders have for so often. And frankly, as you'd point out in the religious dimension, they've not done that.
We talk a lot about this big tech and the relationship between big tech and this administration, whether it's adversarial. But Google specifically in China, assisting Google in developing an app to further censor free expression and the ability of Chinese citizens to get information. Any thoughts on that? How a U.S. company, obviously huge global company too, assists China in that oppression of free expression?
Laura, it is personally and professionally troubling to me when American companies behave one way here and another way when they're dealing with China. It gets at the core problem that President Trump is trying to address, which is that China doesn't permit American investors to invest on the same terms that Chinese companies can invest here. Joint ventures, the list is long of the non-reciprocal relationship. And the president's trying to balance that. And when we get that right, when government gets that right, we can then force American companies to behave under that set of rules. I want every company, including global giants, to treat American citizens as well as they treat the governments in some of these despotic regimes.
And yet they hit the administration, President Trump, a couple days after the election. You got Sergey Brin up there. You got a brilliant guy, brilliant people, but criticizing this administration's immigration policy when they're assisting despotic, basically, obviously communist regimes overseas. But Trump's the threat?
I think we have American foreign policy on the right track on each of the dimensions that you're describing, and when we get it right, when we ultimately see the end result of President Trump's efforts, I think you'll see many of these things in a place that America has not seen before.